Hey everyone, welcome to GKTV. We've got an awesome talk for you today called Mindset of a Champion. Before we get into it, we'll do a little bit of intros. I'm joined here by Sage Casaga, one of the rising stars and investment advisors here at Gerber Kawasaki, and our speaker, Dr. Rick Jensen, who's a world-renowned sports coach and psychologist. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brett Sifling. I'm the director of the Get Invested program here at GK, and the Get Invested program is focused on young investors and getting them started with a financial plan. I was actually a young investor myself. While I only took up golf during the pandemic, I basically played sports my entire life until I found out what the stock market was, and began posting everything that I was doing online on social media, and ended up getting a pretty decent sized following from it. Ran a subscription site that was really focused on healthcare and biotech companies for a number of years. Led me to some really cool places. I was Business Insider's 20 Under 20 of Finance and featured in the Wall Street Journal, and still do a lot of that media coverage for the firm with our CEO, Ross Gerber. So Sage, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself and your experience, since you are the master golfer here.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending this great webinar today we're hosting. I'm very excited for this event. I'm here with my colleague, Brett Sifling, who is the director of our Get Invested program, and also Dr. Rick Jensen, who is a world-renowned golf coach and sports psychologist. My name is Sage Casaga, and I'm an investment advisor here at Gerber Kawasaki Wealth Management and part of our sports group here at GK. And just to give you a little background on myself, I grew up in Southern California, a small city called Murrieta, and I actually picked up a golf club for the very first time when I was about 6 years old. My dad introduced me to the game, and I started out at a local driving range in Murrieta and began playing competitive golf and in tournaments at around age 10. And so my talents in golf allowed me the opportunity to play at Division I at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, where I was a business finance major, as well as a minor in psychology, which is very relevant for today's topic. And, along the way, I met a lot of wealthy individuals on the golf course and heard people talk about their personal finances or investments. And I soon realized that even though these people had successful careers, it didn't necessarily mean that they were financially savvy. And so I got a lot of motivation from that and wanted to understand how I can use all of this finance knowledge that I had to help people make better decisions. And so that's why I became an advisor. And since the beginning of my career, I've actually noticed a lot of similarities between golf and finances. As many of you may deeply understand on this call, that golf can be a very emotional game. And that's similar to dealing with finances, which is also a very emotional topic. And in golf, you have good days and you have bad days and ups and downs. And that's similar to the markets and investing. And so my job as an advisor is to ultimately reduce that stress and financial tension so families don't have to live paycheck to paycheck, and you can reach your goals in life and really maximize your potential. And who knows, maybe this will allow you to have the confidence to knock in those 4-foot putts, and just knowing that your finances are taken care of. So with that, I'll hand it back over to Brett so he can share a little bit more about our firm, Gerber Kawasaki.
Yeah, so for you guys who don't know what Gerber Kawasaki is, we're a full-service financial planning and investment management firm. So we've got over 7,000 clients all over the US and all over the world, and manage over $1 billion for them collectively. And we really have two main programs that are built out at the firm. We have a wealth building program with no minimums that I mentioned. It's really for people getting started. And then we have a more traditional wealth management program. If you already have assets, or you're maybe retired or on the other side of that spectrum. So we really have a basically program that fits the needs of everyone. And ultimately, it's to guide you to maximize your own financial resources. So we're a completely independent firm. We're also fiduciaries, so we have a legal obligation to do what's in your best interest. Ultimately, we are advisors to you. Rick is advisors to golfers, and ultimately you hire people like us so you can play more golf. But in all seriousness, let's kind of introduce our speaker here and get the show on the road.
Yeah, so
go for it. So Rick, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself, or Sage, do you have a question for Rick?
Yeah. So Rick, you've worked with the best. You've coached over 50 touring pros, and your players combined have had over 200 tour victories. 33 major championships and trained tennis players that have won all 4 Grand Slam championships. So clearly you've worked with the most elite athletes. And could you share with our audience, what is it that, makes golfers great and separates these players and ultimately allows them to have a mindset of a champion?
They've done a lot of the things that you've probably, the two of you, have done in financial services. So I'm going to share some slides with you so we can reference some things as we go. So let me just start and get the administrative side taken care of and make sure that you guys can see what I'm looking at. So Brett and Sage, can you see that?
Yep, think we're live.
So let's just go right into it. I've always said the players that I work with, both in golf and tennis, the one thing is for me, I've never had to hit a ball. So I've always said, if you surround yourself with winners, you start looking like one, but they're really the ones doing the work. But the short answer to that question is what separates them from the rest of us mortals is, I would say 2 words: deliberate practice. And some of you that have read, there's some business books like Talent Code or Outliers that actually speak about this, but it's really more of a sport science term in the sense of the quality and the quantity of the work and the effort that a player puts in over a long period of time is really what separates them. And I can give you a couple examples that I queued up that will just give you some color around that. Many of you will know the gentleman on the screen here, Greg Norman. Greg was the Tiger Woods of the 1980s, 1990s, kind of from 1985 to 1995. For about a decade, Greg dominated the PGA Tour. And I was on the range with him in 1995, and I asked him at the time, why do you think you're dominating? What was his reason that he felt he was so dominant at the time? And he just pointed to his chest, and he said, right here. And I said, well, what do you mean right here? And he said, I want it more. And I just said, what, you want what more? And he looks at me and he goes, I want to be number 1 more than anyone you know. Nobody wants it like I do. Now, I work with a lot of players on the tour and have over the years. And I didn't think want is what separated them. So I said that to Greg. I'm like, I've got plenty of guys out here I work with. I don't think want, they all want it. I can't believe you want it that much more than they do. And he goes, well, I don't think they want it like I do. And I said, well, just wait right here. I'll go get them. I'm sure I can find someone who would want to take your place. And he looks at me and he says, well, they might want it, but I'll bet you they don't do with their want what I do with my want. And I said, well, be specific. What do you mean when you say that? And we were on the driving range and he pointed at a pile of golf balls that he was hitting. And he said, well, for one thing, beat golf balls. He goes, there's not a guy out here who hits more balls than I do. He says, I hit more balls in a day. I hit more balls in a month. He goes, and I know I've hit more balls in my lifetime than any of these guys out here. And I stopped him and I said, well, wait a minute. How many days a week do you actually hit balls? And he didn't hesitate. He said 7. I said, every day? He goes, every day. And I said, what time do you get out here each day to start hitting balls? And again, he didn't hesitate. He goes, 20 minutes before light, like it was a time on his watch. And I said, 20 minutes? And he goes, always 20. And I said, well, what's so special about 20? And he just looks at me and he goes, stretching. And I said, stretching? And he said, my stretching routine takes exactly 20 minutes. I do it along the front bumper of my car in the parking lot in the dark with my headlights on. And then he paused and he points at me and he goes, you never stretch in the light. Light is for hitting golf balls. And then, and without dragging the story out too long, we basically he would talk about, he'd get to the range and he'd start working on his game. And I kind of asked him, I said, well, how do you decide what to work on when you're out there every day? And that's when he said the quote that I put here on this screen. He said, I work on the parts of my game that cost me the most shots in competition. So coming back to that idea of deliberate practice, it's this idea of I know what parts of my game are costing me the most shots, and I spend enough time making sure that I shore up those weaknesses. So it's a combination of practicing correctly, practicing plenty, and then practicing in the right areas. If I kind of move a decade later and share with you, just people on the call will know Tiger Woods, certainly. Tiger Woods was I'm going to share with you some stats of Tiger's dominance, or at least his rise to dominance, because he kind of took Greg Norman's place and came out of Stanford in 1996. And by 1997, he was already the #1 player on the PGA Tour. He was #2 in scoring average. And as you can see on these stats, the 4 stats here that I look at that are primary today are, can they hit greens in regulation, driving accuracy, and driving distance combines into total driving. It's the most important stat today. A decade ago, it was actually not as important, but pretty close. Putting, and then short game or scrambling. But you can see here with these stats, Tiger Woods, even when he became the #1 player within a year, still plenty of room for opportunity. And my role with players is really that, is to expose where there's still some gaps in your game, where there's some weaknesses that we would want to go after. So I've always said, top coaches, I would hope myself, top players, they operate what I've always said below the line. So if you see this performance stat line, they pay attention to the factors that are below the line. The media, the fans, we tend to kind of in the papers see who won a tournament, who's #1 on the money list, who's kind of top of the scoring average. But the players and the coaches, we really try to look below that line and find opportunity. Butch Harmon was coaching Tiger at the time. And I asked Butch at the end of 97, what's the plan for 98? Where are you going to head with Tiger? What do you think he needs to work on? And he immediately said driving and putting, and talked about those 2 areas. I asked him, I said, well, what about scrambling? Because he seems to struggle there too. And pretty keenly in terms of knowing how stats work, he looks at me and he goes, well, the problem with that scrambling stat is it includes a putt. It's measured by up and downs. So he would say he's good at the up, but he's bad at the down. He's really not a good putter. And he had all his, without dragging it out again, he had reasons that he didn't release his right hand through the putter. He'd kind of drag the putter down the line, take it off plane. I asked him about this driving, and he said to me, I said, what do you think is wrong with his driving? He said 2 things. He goes, he hits it far and he hits it crooked. He says, and when he does those 2 things at the same time, he hits houses. And he said, so I don't mind long, you just can't be crooked if you're going to hit it that long. So we've got to take care of that. Again, when I asked him what did he think was the problem, he felt he had a bad golf swing, but he couldn't change it because he didn't think Tiger was fit enough to go through the changes that he needed Tiger to make. So he had actually referred him to Keith Clevens, who was Tiger's fitness guy. And Tiger had been working with Keith the entire year prior. And Butch then was saying to me at the end of 97, he's fit enough now. We can make the changes that we need to make. And they went on and did that. Interestingly, I'll show you his numbers. So the entire next year, they basically worked on changing his golf swing, which the media critiqued heavily because they felt if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And then they changed his putting stroke. And you can see here, he kind of took what Tiger would call, he would say sometimes you have to take 2 steps backwards to get 3 steps forward. And so what you're seeing here is kind of the consequence of, or the risk of making a swing change. And all those that are on the call that have tried to make a swing change will understand what it feels like to change your grip or to change your swing or to get the club in a different position. There's a time period that you have to go through where you'll kind of take a step back before you'll move forward. At this level, what's really interesting, I refer to this as stick-to-itness. Butch always felt like this was one of Tiger's greatest attributes, is that he could stick through the pain of kind of going backwards. And you don't tend to see that. Most people, when they go backwards, certainly at this level, it's scary. It's a leap of faith of whether we can kind of get through that over time. Many people just revert back and will go back to their 1997 swing. But it's kind of the study of a plateau. It's why people don't get better over time and they do plateau. So Tiger and Butch stuck through it, kind of understanding you can't just repair big things in just 12 months. If I show you his numbers going to 1999, they kept training. And by 2000, this is kind of the Tiger that made history. You know, at the point he was here, he was kind of, I always say he dominated the performance stats, the items below the line, in addition to the outcomes. And in 2000, when he won the Tiger Slam, he won all 4 majors in a row, starting in 2000 and into 2001. And one last interesting stat that's interesting I've always found here is in in the year 97, Tiger was number 1. David Duval was number 2. If you skip to 99, when Tiger got back to number 1, the number 2 player was still David Duval. The number 1 and 2 players hadn't even changed. But what had changed was the difference between them. In 97, Tiger beat David Duval by $200,000. And in 1999, that $200,000 became $3 million. And then in 2000, Tiger was number 1, and Phil Mickelson had come into the number 2 position, but Tiger beat Phil that year by $4.5 million. So it's a kind of a long-winded answer to that's what deliberate practice looks like. It's sustained, deliberate effort over a long period of time. It's just the opposite of what we see many amateurs do, which we're kind of conditioned through the media today and to have short attention spans. We'll work on something for a month, for 2 buckets of balls, for the week. And then if it doesn't work on Sunday, we abandon it, watch the Golf Channel, get our golf magazine, get online and kind of find some YouTube videos that might give us a quick fix. They're quite the opposite of that.
Dr. Rick, before I ask you another question, I did want to see if you could share with the audience what a Tiger Slam is.
The Tiger Slam is basically he won all 4 majors in a row. So he held all 4 trophies, but he didn't win them all in the same year. He won several in 2000, and then he continued in 2001.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you can improve your mental approach, and maybe you can touch on how that relates to the physical aspect of the game? Like, are these 2 things independently, or can you kind of think of them as that way, or are they linked?
They're undoubtedly linked. I think for me, I've certainly promoted that I'm a little unique because I taught golf. I taught golf through college. As an undergrad, I taught at a golf academy every summer. So I kind of have a background on the teaching side of the game, then went to school, studied psychology, studied sports science, studied sports psychology through graduate school. And one of the things I learned early on is I've said it to this day, it sounds a bit crass, but I'll say to tour players, if you're not good, you'll soon be mental. So there is a relationship between how good somebody is and how mentally tough they are. And if you went back and read the magazines back in this period where we talk about Tiger Woods in 2000, many people just talked about the fact that he was so mentally tough in the majors and that people couldn't beat him. But everybody else in the majors in terms of just pure skill, and those things go hand in hand. You can't think your way out of a bad golf swing if your golf swing is going to hook every other ball. You have to address the physical side. But on the other hand, I've certainly worked with players who have an incredible amount of talent and they get in their own way. Their expectations are too high. They get upset over just a couple of bad shots when everyone hits misses. They overreact or overthink when they do make an error and they kind of start tinkering with their game way too soon. So there's certainly the mental side of the game. But for me, having been in it for 30 years, I've always said I'd rather have a foundation of skill. I would argue as a psychologist, many of the mental skills I train players to do, I would argue I do them pretty well. I don't have a player I work with who can't beat me. And so my mental aptitude certainly doesn't override the fact that their talent is so much greater than is mine. I'll give you an example. I have a picture of a chain here. I brought one I have sitting right here. But the way I try to explain it to players is many times as a sports psychologist, you get referrals because people do think they're mental. So they will call and say, oh, I choked at this event. Certainly at a tour level, if they're in contention on Sunday and have a chance to win and pump a couple drives out of bounds, they feel like they choked. Their caddy might say that to them. Their spouse may say that to them. But it's not always a mental choke. Sometimes it's something beyond that. So when someone comes to me and says, hey, I choked at this event, I had a chance to win, or I made the Ryder Cup team, but I didn't win a single match, I just fell apart, they'll experience these symptoms of stress. And so I've always had this chain, and I'll say to them, let me try to explain how golf works. And I take a link on a chain. I say, each one of these links, this is your golf game. And each link is a part of the game. So this might be your driving distance. This is your driving accuracy. This is your greens and regulation, your putting, your chipping, your pitching. All these things combined, you have to play with this entire chain. But most of us that play just casual golf, this chain is just kind of swinging on our arms, nice and comfortable. That's not tour golf. Frankly, it's not even amateur golf if we're playing for money, playing big matches, playing club championships. There is pressure that's imposed on this chain that feels like this. And as you can see, if I pull hard enough on a chain, it can break. And if it does, it breaks at the weakest link. And so many times the pressure is experienced as a choke, but the choke comes because the player feels pressure, but experiences a missed putt, a missed 3-footer, a ball that went out of bounds, a chunked wedge, a fluffed bunker shot. Then they come to me and they say, I choked, almost like I could sit them on a couch and just talk them off of that. But what I've always done more importantly is I say, let's look at the chain, because if the chain has weaknesses in it, we need to go in and shore up that chain. And if we can shore up that chain, you can pull on a chain. I would argue Dustin Johnson in the Masters, this chain was getting pulled on throughout that entire round. He described that he was anxious during the entire round and felt the pressure, but his skills didn't break down. They were phenomenal. They held up the whole time. I put a couple examples in here, Sage, of this just for those of you that are not to overplay Greg Norman. But Greg Norman had one of the biggest chokes we've ever seen in golf in 1996 at the Masters. If you remember, he had a 6-shot lead on Nick Faldo going into Sunday morning in the final round and then lost the entire event that day. I think Nick beat him by 5. I asked Greg after that event, what did he think happened? People were calling it a choke, and he was really clear. He said that it certainly was a choke, depending on if you define a choke as I crashed and burned. He said, but I don't know that it was a mental choke. I would call it a technical choke that led to some mental issues. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I was hitting the ball terribly going into that event. Just people don't know that. He said, I almost didn't play the Masters that year. I was playing so poorly. He said, and I went to Butch to try to change my golf swing. And he says to me, he worked with Butch Harmon at the time. And he said, Butch said to me, we don't have time to change this. You'll get caught in a downswing. So he kind of talked me, just go there and play to the fat of every green and just try to get in play off the tee. There's a lot of room off the tee at Augusta. And he said, so our game plan was just get it in anywhere in play and then aim for the fat of the green. Don't chase any pins. He said, and that's what I did for 3 days. And I said, well, you had a 6-shot lead after Saturday going into Sunday. I said, you couldn't have been hitting it that bad. Who has a 6-shot lead when they're hitting it poorly? And he looks right at me and he goes, you don't know where I was aiming. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, you can't say that unless I tell you where I was aiming. He goes, if you're aiming at the fat of the green and the pin is 15 yards to the right, tucked back in the back right corner, and you hit an 8-iron to the middle of the green and it ends up 2 feet next to that pin, the gallery gives you a standing ovation. You just whiffed an 8-iron 15 yards. He says, but it ends right next to the pin. He said, my caddy and I were laughing for 3 days at how many balls I missed that ended up right next to the hole. I could walk you through the rounds and tell you where I was aiming and how far off that ball went, but it kept going in the good direction. And he said, come to Sunday, he goes, everything on the front nine on Sunday, it couldn't have been worse. I still was playing the same strategy, middle of the green. He said, but now it would go the other way. He said, and the other way would be a bunker, a false front, a pond. And he said, if I made a mental mistake, he said, what I did is when I made the turn on the back nine, I was so angry that I entered a major without my skills in place that I decided I'd try to fix them. He said, and I've never done that in a tournament. I don't try to fix my golf game in the middle of a tournament. I've never done it. He said, and you saw the result. He said, I started tinkering with my swing on the back nine and it just got worse. And I'll never do it again. Dustin Johnson, who just won the Masters, I just threw a slide in here. If we just go back 5 years, he had a chance to win. I think it was his first U.S. Open. It would have been his first U.S. Open at the 2015 U.S. Open in Chambers Bay outside Seattle. Jordan Spieth had finished his round. He was in the clubhouse. He had a one-shot lead on Dustin. Dustin was trying to catch him coming into the back nine. We got to the 18th hole. He still hadn't caught him. He was one shot back. The 18th hole at Chambers Bay is a par 5. Dustin Johnson hits it a long way. He can reach the screen in 2. He gets up on the tee. Again, I would argue this chain is getting tugged pretty hard. And he smashes a driver about 340 yards right down the center. He has a 250-yard shot into the green. He grabs a 5-iron, and he smashes a 5-iron 250 yards to 12 feet from the hole. And then you're seeing this image here. This is the 12-footer he had to win the tournament, and he proceeds to knock the first one 4 feet by. He pulls the next 4-footer and missed it, 3 putts, and gives the tournament away to Jordan Spieth. And again, the word on the street is choke, biggest choke you've ever seen. You wouldn't believe it. He's a head case. But if you again look at his numbers were here. And this is a really interesting stat if you see just these 4 statistics, because what's interesting is under the pressure, under the tug of this chain, he hit a drive right down the middle, 350 yards, 340, and then he hits a 5-iron to 12 feet. The average 250-yard shot for a tour player is about 50 feet. He hit it to 12. But if you look at those first 2 stats, he was second on tour in driving, and he was 4th in tour in approach shots outside of 200 yards. But now he's got a 12-footer under the same pressure. This is still getting tugged on, but it's now testing a different link, and it's going after his putting. Well, in putting, he was ranked 121st in 1 putts, and then the 4-footer, which is the ultimate pressure cooker, he's ranked 177th at the time. They only rank about 180 guys. So that's a real prime example is once you know that, would you really sit him down and try to talk him in? If it was a mental thing, why didn't it impact his driving? Why didn't it impact that 5-iron? Why did it only impact the putting? And going back to your original question, Sage, those things go hand in hand. You have to, if I'm not good, I will feel anxious. And if the pressure is there, it is likely to kind of pop the chain.
Yeah. So, Dr. Rick, we know you work with a lot of professionals, but there are some amateurs that are listening to this call. And so what is the most common mistake that you see amateurs make in golf? And are these similar to the same ones that professionals make?
Yeah, I would say they are similar. Well, professionals, their errors just aren't as severe. So obviously their golf swings are better. They practice so much more, right? They're hitting, Tiger in his prime would hit 1,500 balls a day. Who has time to do that if we're amateurs? If we have families, if we have jobs, we don't have time to do that. So for good reason, they're very good. So I think probably if there's a mental thing amateurs do, it's that their expectations are too high. They expect to play at a level better than they have the time to develop that level of game. And when they don't develop the level of game that their expectations are set for, they kind of break the rules of motor learning or skill acquisition. In other words, they start going after quick fixes, trying to shortchange the process. The process I shared with you with Tiger, which is kind of stick to something long enough to master it. That phrase, Arnold Palmer told me the greatest lesson he learned from his dad was that phrase, and I've stolen it from him ever since. He said, my dad taught me the greatest lesson I ever learned in golf, and it was to stick to something long enough to master it. And Arnold explained to me, he said, I only had one teacher my entire life. It was his father. He said, and we mastered our approach to golf. He said, and that's not what we see amateurs do. Amateurs are constantly jumping from teacher to teacher, from tip to tip, from book to book, looking for something that will make them a master. He said, but that's not really how it gets done. It gets done through practicing within one system, not jumping from system to system. So I would argue if the biggest error, I don't think amateurs make an error of not practice. They should practice more, but reality sets in. I don't practice more, and I know I should. I don't have time. I have a family. I have a job. Those things take precedent to my golf game. So I just lower my expectations and understand I'm going to play to a certain level. and it kind of keeps me in check. If I want to lower my handicap, I know I'd have to reallocate my time. But I also wouldn't jump from teacher to teacher, from kind of quick fix to quick fix. It's kind of, I always say golf is a little bit of the land of the cookie diet. Everybody's kind of looking for to shortchange a proven process. And if that was doable, the tour players would do it, because why wouldn't they? But it doesn't work.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting way to approach the mental game. And as coaches, finance coaches ourselves, we see a lot of these weak links, whether it's in young investors or for retirees. And so one of the main weak links, I think, in retirees is just accumulation, and really just not even having enough money to begin with. And as weird as this sounds, as crazy as this sounds, $1 million is not what it used to be. And when we're looking at, how much you can generate off of an investment account or live off that in retirement, it's really only 5%. And that $1 million is only going to give you $50,000 a year to live off of. And people don't understand that you need to start saving earlier and earlier to actually have enough accumulation to live that life. And the second thing is, a longevity risk. And so a lot of people, I've had clients that think that you just pull all your money out of stocks and put it all in a savings account when you retire. I have people that are close to retirement, not working anymore, and 100% stocks, being way too aggressive, not realizing that this money has to last you for the rest of your life. And the old school way of just taking all your money out and putting it in government bonds and earning 5 to 10% a year, that's no longer the case in this new world. And in a world that's starved for yield, you also have to protect yourself and protect your assets. And as an independent firm, we have access to stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, annuities, alternative investments, all of these things that can not only protect your plan, but protect the lifestyle that you want to live through these golden years. One other main weak link I see is social isolation. And, we've all kind of been socially isolated this year through the pandemic, and retirees are especially susceptible to this. And this is exactly why we have these types of social events on the GKTV or on our socials that we're pushing out every single week, so we can stay connected, not only with each other, but with the Gerber Kawasaki community. A little bit less fun to talk about is things like long-term care, but it's also super important. And it's, if you want to have the best quality of life during those later years, we actually have an insurance specialist on staff that can take a look at your current long-term care policies. We can see if there's any risks that are built into it. I'm not sure if you guys know this, but it actually costs about $10,000 a month just to live in a long-term care facility in California. And that's not anything with, the bells and whistles. That's kind of like the bare minimum. And another not fun to think about thing is, basically estate planning and generational wealth. No one wants to kind of talk about morality. It's a very hard concept, especially in your older years. And so having a trust set up so that, one, your assets can go to the people that you want them to go to and are used in a way that you expect them to be used for, but also so you're not caught in what's called probate, which is a very lengthy and expensive process, especially in California. So if you don't want everyone knowing every single asset you have and you want it going to the right people, it's a super important part of your plan, and oftentimes something that's just missed. There's a couple even famous cases of people that didn't have trusts, like Michael Jackson, that's even still being fought over because he didn't have the proper estate plan in place. And this generational wealth goes right into that. You do not want to be paying all this money in taxes when there's ways that you can just pass this to your loved ones or the people that you really want it to go. So these are just a couple when it comes to retirees. And all of these things are what we look at when a person approaches us and we look through their financial plan, or we're building a financial plan to make sure that these chain links don't break. And we do the same thing with young investors. So Sage, why don't you talk about some of the links that you look for?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Brett. And so we work with a lot of young investors, and we have a wealth building program. And so we're not here to tell you whether or not you should save or spend your money, but the reality is that many young people don't save for for their future. And it's important to save your money and plan for your future. And the best secret to saving and investing is dollar cost averaging. And it's a strategy that we teach our younger investors, and it's proven to work over long periods of time, and really the best way to build wealth each month and really put yourself in a good position for your future. And so getting rich quick would obviously be great, but it's very unrealistic for many and unlikely. It's like if you shoot in the 90s for 18 holes of golf and then you expect to be shooting in the 70s the next day. So that's great if that happens, but we can't plan on that. And so many young investors also are trading on margin, and that's very risky and may not be the best strategy for your investments. So we teach all of our younger investors and clients about all of these things and take time to completely customize everything to your situation. So maybe your goals are to eventually buy a home, or maybe it's just to get ahead in life so you can do fun things like travel and vacation. And so that's what we educate our clients on, and how to really go about investing your money so that you can reach these goals. And the last link that is critical for young investors is debt burdens. And it's actually one of the biggest issues that we have in America today is the amount of student loan debt outstanding. And many think that they can't invest because they have student loan debt, but there are actually a lot of ways to pay student loans simultaneously while building up other assets and not forgetting about these other goals in your life. So with that being said, let's bring it back to golf. Everybody knows Tiger Woods, and he seemed to sort of fallen off the map. Obviously, he won the Masters last year, and he's had some good tournaments, but what's going on with Tiger? Can you give us some updates, Dr. Rick?
Yeah, certainly what happened with Tiger he's been playing fairly well recently. He's just really fallen off the radar screen in the last 10 years. He, again, won the Masters last year, played well there, the Tour Championship, and then was playing pretty well. But again, age is clearly part of the issue. I put these stats together just to share with those of you on the call, because he's really been off the radar screen since 2009. That's really where his game fell apart. If you kind of went back and looked into the media, what the media was saying happened to Tiger was really tied around his marriage, his infidelity, and that was highly publicized and certainly probably had an impact on his game. I've always looked deeper than just one issue. Typically, if somebody just goes from dominating the game to falling off the game, there were other factors that went on. Certainly in 2009, if you recall, he had knee surgery. At the time, he kind of had hobbled around Torrey Pines when he won in Torrey Pines, and then kind of hadn't won since. But he had knee surgery after that, was having to now recover from that. And soon as players, it's not the surgery itself, it's the lack of practice during the rehab that really kind of hits their game. And then there were certainly the issues that were going on in his family. So if you looked at him going through a divorce, and so he's now recovering from knee surgery, going through divorce court, trying to keep his sponsors together, trying to kind of figure out what he's going to do in his family, it's pulling him away from what we talked about initially, Sage, which is the deliberate practice. One of the things that's always been intriguing to me with Tiger is I've always shown this picture in seminars that I do. I'll kind of show this image with these various people when people say, hey, what really happened to Tiger? And I think what's underlying a lot of that has to do with maintaining relationships. And so if you look at this image, Tiger dominated the game from the time he left Stanford through 2002, working with the top upper left people here. Basically, you have Fluff Cowan, who was his caddy, and Butch Harmon. And to the right of Butch is his father. And again, Butch to the far right is Keith Cleffins. This was Tiger's player support team early in his career, 1996 through 2002. 2002, Tiger had a falling out with Fluff. He had a falling out with Butch, and he fired both of them, and they left. And he hired Stevie Williams, who's in the bottom left, and Hank Haney, who's two over to the right from Stevie, and as his caddy and coach. Well, Hank at the time had said to me, Hank used to say he didn't like the way Tiger swung the club at all. He didn't think that Butch was teaching him the right mechanics. And he basically broke Tiger's game apart and built it up in a different way. When you start from scratch at that level, it has a serious impact on your game. And it did. In 2003, 4, and 5, Tiger went into a slump. And to Tiger's credit, he learned Hank Haney's methodology and he mastered it. And he got back to where he was back on top of the world going 2006, 7, 8, and into 9. When his father passed away along the way, and then when he got into 2009, basically the stats that I shared with you, again, when you look back here, he did have that falling out with his wife, with Elin. But then when you look at the other people that are in this image, what also happened in 2009, Steve Williams, Tiger fired Steve. Tiger fired Hank Haney, or Hank fired Tiger, depending on who you speak to. Elin fired Tiger, and so they all went away. Tiger then also fired Keith Clevens, and all of those people went away and were replaced with Sean Foley, who's in the bottom right. And Sean came on the scene, but that's a very big disruption to a player support team, which is critical at this level. And then Tiger only kept Sean on retainer for maybe 18 months, and then he fired Sean. He then hired Chris Como, who Chris currently works with Bryson DeChambeau, but I think Tiger worked with Chris for about a year, let Chris go, and has really been without a coach since. So I've always talked about that as the value of strategic partnerships, of what we call player support teams. When Brett, when you and Sage are talking about kind of the weak links, really what you're using this player support team, just like I'm part of a player support team, and we all work together to really try to do our due diligence and find the weak links in a player's game, but more importantly, be able to convince the player as to what is the solution to those issues. And you guys, I'm sure, do the same thing with your clients around financial issues. And you don't want to keep changing that up every time you change that up, the team itself will have a different philosophy, and it's hard enough to learn the first to basically Arnold Palmer's point. If you stick to something long enough, you can master it. But if you're hopping every 7 years, it's kind of hard to do that. Last couple of examples. If you look at the game today, Jordan Spieth struggling today. He was the dominant player in the game going back over the last, 5 years, and is struggling over the last 2 years. To his credit, he's sticking with Cameron McCormick. He didn't struggle and then say, I'll jump from Cameron and move to someone else. They will be building this themselves and rebuilding where he sees errors in his game. So he has been with Cameron McCormick since he was 12 years old. And again, if you look at when Tiger was having problems early on or had gaps in his game, he made swing changes. He made putting changes within his camp of Butch Harmon, and it took him to the top of the game. So players will go through slumps. The issue is, what do they do when they're going through those periods? And so I've always tried to be an advocate of keeping people married, is what I'll say. I want to keep the relationship. Certainly can't do that forever, but you don't want to jump every time there's a blip in performance. Look at Rory McIlroy, again, one of the top 5 players in the game. Today, Rory works with a gentleman called, his name's Michael Bannon. Michael Bannon was Rory's golf coach back in Northern Ireland when Rory was 8 years old. They have been together since Rory was 8. When Rory signed, I worked with Titleist. Rory left Titleist and moved to Nike. Nike paid him like $100 million to transfer to Nike. And when he got that money, he went to Michael Bannon and basically hired him full-time away from his club pro job in Northern Ireland. And now Michael travels with him full-time, and he's his full-time coach. But they've been together that long. Just another example of that is Jason Day. Jason Day, as a child, he had some issues in his family. Had some difficulties with his father. They took him. He was troubled, and they put him into a high school. He started playing golf for that high school, and his coach was Colin Swatton. And his coach to this day is still Colin Swatton. So they've been together that long. Colin was Jason's high school golf coach. He he's caddied with him. I think this year was the first year he stopped caddying for him just so he could coach full time. But they've been together that entire time. I'll kind of just, again, I think that brings us back to that issue of kind of what we do as mentors. And Brett, you said it at the beginning. I'm kind of a mentor to professional athletes, as you guys are a mentor to affluent or even aspiring affluent individuals. And I think that the issue is that we try to establish relationships with our clients for the long term. I don't think you have quick fixes on the financial side. I don't have quick fixes on the golf side, but what I do have is something that gets delivered through the relationship. And the better I can maintain the relationship over the long haul, the more trust people have in the services I provide. And frankly, the more likely they are to execute on them.
Yeah, absolutely. The team is so important. And, before we kind of get into that too, if you guys do have any questions, either for, Dr. Rick or even myself or Sage as well, feel free to just type them in the chat box and we'll get to those right now. But what you're saying, that this team is what we pride ourselves here at GK. We work very, very closely together, whether it's our investment committee. We have multiple CFPs on staff. We have a tax and accounting division now. We've got the insurance division, and all of these players on your team are really just the collective, experience of 25 different advisors and individuals that you get to use. So when you work with someone like myself, or you work with someone like Sage, you get that collective experience. And, we're on the team now of over 7,000 people and families all over the US. And that's extremely important to us. So, it's also interesting that, working with someone for a long, long time, a lot of people work with older advisors, and they don't realize that if you work with an older advisor, they're going to have to retire themselves, most likely, within the decade. And so if you're working with a young advisor like our team, we're going to be here for the rest of your retirement plan, the rest of your life, and probably most of your kids' life too. So it's a huge added benefit to have that relationship over the next 40 years. And also, when you're looking at investing, it's important to look at the future. So, hiring young advisors, who better to know the future than young people, because we're building it. So let's kind of get into some questions now. Sage, do you want to kind of read off some?
Yeah. So first question is, if you watch the Masters this past weekend, Tiger actually had a 10 on a par 3. It's his highest score on a par 3 in any major. And then he proceeded after that to birdie 5 of his last 6 holes. So I know he's had some bumps in the road, but he's still kind of Tiger in a sense. And I listened to his interview afterwards, and he said, golf is like any other sport, where isn't like any other sport, because you're so alone out there and you kind of have to figure it out. And he was talking about, how you have to commit to shots and talking to a caddy when things get challenging. And he was actually referencing the wind that he had to talk with his caddy about. And so it tends to get a little bit windy at Augusta. But my question is, why do you think it's so difficult for people to stay with the same team, even for a guy like Tiger?
Yeah, I think it's very challenging. I think in general, we're all wanting results, and we want them as quickly as we could potentially get them. And so I think that there's not enough education for people to understand. That's why just me doing this call with you and your clients today is important, because it's my way of saying to people, you can get better at the game of golf. You can build wealth, as you would probably say to clients all the time, if you stick to a process that's proven over time. There are, again, my doctorate's in that space, but I would argue most of the offerings that are out there in golf are not by people who have doctorates in skill acquisition or motor learning or sports science. It's people that are trying to make money off of people who are trying to get a game quicker than they might otherwise get it. So certainly I would argue, and maybe even those people are making more money than I make, in the sense of trying to sell what I would call kind of the cookie diet, or the quick fix, or the training aid that will change your putting tomorrow. People want to get better fast, and I think too often they're willing to look for the shortcut. But I don't see that. I've never met a tour player that got there that way. There's not a person I can name in 30 years on tour that everyone looks at and goes, oh, that guy got here way faster than everybody else. Well, let's all go figure out what, it just doesn't happen that way. And, so
would you say that, like, if you do have a coach that's putting you on the cookie diet or something like that, like, how do you know that you have a bad coach and that you need to get rid of him?
I think there's something, again, I think you have to be honest with that, right? I think there's times where you can kind of look at your coach, and if your coach every week is coming with something new, maybe they're on a cookie, they're kind of on the internet finding things, and you're their guinea pig and they're testing them on you. So I think there's part of it's buyer beware. So part of it is understand the process, really educate yourself about what good training looks like. Ask around, really find out what you do find is the good players find the good coaches. So in your local areas, if you find coaches who either were professionals themselves, that means they got pretty good over time, or professionals do go to them. You don't find people at a professional level doing it as often as we might see the club player do it. So do your research, try to really find out who's well known, but also be aware this is an environment where I don't think that the golf coaches, the green grass coaches at the clubs, I think they're doing a real good job trying to get players to do it. If anything, when I train them, they're saying to me, how can I make sure that I can get someone to stick with me long enough to get good without hopping from person to person? I think the coaches kind of feel like they're trying to struggle with maintaining a long-term relationship with a player, and without kind of having to promise to meet an unrealistic expectation on the part of a player.
I think that expectations is a huge thing, right? And especially if they're, over promising is a big thing with that cookie diet is, getting a realistic expectation on where you can be with your financial plan or where you could be with your golf game, and kind of sticking to it that way. Let's see if any other questions came in here. In the meantime, if we're seeing any questions come in, make sure you guys are subscribed to our YouTube channel as well. We're putting out events exactly like this every single week on different topics, whether you're a young investor or in the middle or retired as well. We also put a ton of content out on Instagram. So the @Gerber Kawasaki Instagram, or on Twitter, I'm @BSifling Trades. Dr. Rick Jensen, you also have a book that he was gracious enough to send us. So I wanted to show you guys that, and you can check it out on his website. If you guys, I already read through most of it. I thought it was brilliant. So I wanted to share that with you guys. But other than that, it doesn't look like we had any more questions come in. Sage, are you seeing any?
I don't have any on my end.
Okay. So, yeah. Dr. Rick, it was a pleasure having you on today. We sincerely appreciate the talk and learned so much. So we're looking forward to the next one, and looking forward to improving my golf game, at least, because I got a lot of work to do to get up to Sage's level, and helping a lot of people with their financial plans and investing as well. So if you guys in the audience do have any questions at all, please reach out to us directly, just Brett or Sage at GerberKawasaki.com. We're going to offer every single person on this webinar actually a complimentary consultation. We'll sit down with you for an hour for free and go over your plan and try to find any of those weak links. So until next week, it was great seeing you all, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rick Jensen, and everyone on this call.